the process is the same, right? We just put in place more safety protocols, right? So let's say she was actually dog aggressive. That first time we put the muzzle on and put her in the group, she went after the other dogs, right? Obviously, we can't just let her go after other dogs, but we do need to socialize her still. So I would need to then look at, I need to create this prerequisite of having some communication established to be able to discipline for that choice. Right? So if we have enough training on the dog, or a baseline of training on the dog, what we could do is when we put her in that situation and she goes to aggress, I can correct her for that, right? And then at least I can get you neutral, where you're not outwardly going after these dogs, so I could begin that socialization process of getting you used to being around them. Yeah. From there, it's just slower, right? A lot of dogs that are actually aggressive, you correct from initially, and you teach them, don't fight, flight if anything, right? Give yourself space, go somewhere else, right? Then it just takes some time for them to get comfortable. So fill me in here. What are some of our goals with both her as well as yourself we're trying to accomplish, obviously?
So with her, so she has like almost like foam at your mouth dog reactivity on leash. And when I fostered her, we lived in a condo. Yeah. So it was like less than ideal. And we think about a 30-story condo and how many times you'll see a dog opening those elevator doors. Now she lives in like a suburb, but her reactivity hasn't gotten any better. Yeah. So Jess, who is her owner, tried, it was like, she mentioned in the form, it was like some sort of like obedience-esque training. And the most recent thing was, there was a lot of redirection, and the most like recent piece of feedback, I guess, when she was still working with the trainer, was like, if you see a lot of dogs and off-leash dogs on your route when she walks her, you gotta like change her route. Because, like, there's no option to change her route. That's the only route. So that's not a.
Is that there's a lot of off-leash dogs and stuff in that area?
She's in the burbs.
Yeah.
So people, she has been rushed once or twice. Yeah. Off-leash dogs. So her goal is to just get her to walk well. Yeah. The tricky part is that so when she was rescued, she had photos and stuff of like, she's probably just kept on a rope for a really long time.
You mentioned that.
Like probably like a couple centimeters. And then she had a collapsed trachea, or almost a collapsed trachea when she was just adopted. And we were using the bone at that point. So the goals for her is just to be able to walk well. Ideally, to be able to socialize with other dogs too. That'd be great, like off leash. Sure. But has she ever actually played with another dog before? So I have footage of her on a really loose leash at the shelter, interacting with other dogs, and she seemed fine. Okay. So I'm not sure what it was. And for me, I just wanted to go through the process with her.
Yeah, sure.
I haven't like learned like a full end-to-end color type of situation, so that's something I would like to pick up.
Okay. So you can just drop your leash if you want. So as far as, again, personal goals on your end, you want to go through a program, obviously, just kind of see how it goes and stuff. Remind me, are you trying to get into training? Or are you just trying to improve your handling skills for the rescues and stuff? That's kind of it? Okay, I got you. All right. Well, what we'll do today is we're going to kind of treat today like a big assessment for her. I want to see how she just responds just overall to training stuff, social stuff. We're going to get her in with some other dogs right away today. I want to see how she does with that. And just kind of make the call on what direction we're going to need to go over these next handful of sessions that we have. Has she worn the muzzle before?
She has.
Is she pretty comfortable with it?
Yeah.
Perfect.
She hasn't worn it in a while, but I think just started her on it relatively recently before this.
Okay. So, you know, just from a general, like, first impression standpoint, right? So, like, she's really hyperactive, you could tell, right? Like, just how you got her out of the car and just that spring-loaded energy of, like, here, 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 right? And those are always, like, the most reactive dogs that we see. And it's, like, not even from, like, an aggression standpoint. It's just they're so freaking wound up all the time. And, like, such this ball of energy. You put the single iota of, like, restraint on them, and it just explodes. You know what I mean? The positive here, right, is once we drop that leash, like there's obviously another dog there. There's a lot of energy and stuff going on over there, and she doesn't seem super interested in it. You know what I mean? So sometimes we'll see reactivity that isn't even necessarily like geared towards a specific thing. Like it can be triggered by a dog or triggered by a person or whatever it may be, but it's just like general reactivity. You know what I mean? She just has like a reactive nervous system that just like explodes at things, right? So we'll see obviously as she kind of starts to explore her way over there what she does. But so far that's actually a positive, because that means when we remove the restraint, she may still be jumpy and stuff, but she's not like seeking out conflict towards a specific trigger. So again, we'll see what she does once she's here, but all right, give her one more minute, and we're actually gonna start with some of the social stuff with her. I want to just, well, once we get over there, because we're gonna take her over there for it. We'll pop it on once we get over there. Yeah. So now obviously we'll see, I'm gonna grab that leash and pull her away from that. I wanna see what she does when I do that, obviously. So a lot of times that is where you'll see it really build up, right? When we're physically pulling them away from a trigger, that's where it goes from like 0 to 60. So basically the general idea behind working through reactivity is we want to get the dog to consciously make those decisions, so we're not needing to physically micromanage them so much, right? I talk about, you know, with barriers and stuff, whether it's a leash or a window or a fence or anything that causes a lot of reactivity, I basically, you know, obviously they're necessary things, leashes and fences, but I want to make them obsolete from the standpoint of I don't need this thing to get her to disengage from that fence, or I don't need that gate there to get her to not go into that other area, et cetera, right? So, okay, we're gonna take her back over this way. This is one of those things that I think, you know, getting to like rescues and stuff, like more of your side of things of like helping rescue dogs, I think that a lot of people don't give dogs fair assessments as far as their social skills, because the reactive dogs, because we don't have control over them, we try to do the interaction on leash, which just makes it worse and just makes them look scarier, right? 9 out of 10 times when we get dogs that come in from owners that say, my dog's dog aggressive, they're really just reactive, and once we throw them in a social, they're perfectly fine, right? Now, it's not always the case, obviously, but our initial assessment has to be done in a way where the dog can express themselves in their truest self, you know? Meaning it's gotta be off leash, right? And obviously we need to be safe about it, that's why we use muzzles, right? But it's gotta be done in that off leash setting. And with a...
To care less or more about the person.
Sure, yeah. And in most of these cases, right, if we could just get these dogs a couple of friends, it's funny how we see that like immediately relate to their reactivity, because dogs become less novel when they're out and about. Right. Now you got to be careful with obviously those really like hyperactive dogs. It's not even that it's aggression, but like they could get triggered easily by things and just go into this frenzy that could start fights. But it's typically not, again, geared towards the dog. Like I'm trying to attack the dog, you know?
It's just they are.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Past that, obviously, understanding noises and stuff is very, very important, right? Like right there, she'll let out that little weird, call it a grumble, call it a growl, call it whatever you want to call it. Some dogs are just noisy, right? Like Vinny, my Malinois, like he is a noisy freaking dog, right? He makes all sorts of weird noises. You'll be petting him sometimes and he likes it and he's like, you know? Sometimes he's playing with other dogs, he grumbles and growls, but knowing the dog that you're working with, right? Knowing him, that growl doesn't turn into him trying to attack the other dog ever. It's just his way of expressing himself. Right. Now again, every dog's a little different with it, but as we're assessing the dog, we need to figure those things out.
Yep.
This is great.
Her body language is so much softer than on leash. Like even on leash with the other dog, she's just looking for it.
Yeah.
She's outside sometimes. So this morning when we went for a walk, so I can get a chance to see.
Sure.
How do you balance, so the dog is, I have a friend who has a dog who's like mostly pitty, and she comes out sort of what you were talking about, like
hot.
Really, really, really hot.
Yeah.
And how do you balance like dogs, having a balance of help that dog learn to be less hot without putting too much
Sure.
of a negative emphasis on that other dog to
No, that's a good, I understand what you're asking. So there's a couple of dynamics to that question. So first and foremost, we have to understand we're not going to change who the dog is, right? A high-strung, wound-up dog is always going to be a high-strung, wound-up dog. That dog may be able to be a controlled, high-strung, wound-up dog, but they're always going to be like that to some extent, right? So we need to look at then, let's say we're taking a dog that's really high energy and we're letting them in the group, right? And they come in with a lot of energy, but they're not really doing anything wrong. They're just at like a level 10, right? And another dog comes over and attacks that dog over it, let's say hypothetically, right? A lot of times we look at it from the lens of almost kind of how you're asking of, well, how do I decrease the energy of that dog to prevent that dog from attacking it? When in actuality, it's the other dog's issue. You know what I mean? Now, let's say the dog is high energy and wound up and jumping all over. You know, let's say I let this dog out and this dog was crazy and ran over to you and started jumping all over you, right? That's a different story, right? And then a dog came over and attacked her, right? That's that dog disciplining that dog for an unstable energy, right? Doing something with it. You know what I mean? This is great.
I know you.
And again, things like this, right? This is really important to see these things because a lot of people that don't understand dogs will look at that and be like, oh my God, she's trying to bite him, right? That's absolutely not at all what that was, right? That was her communicating a boundary, right? This dog started coming in hot, like you were just saying, right? And she said, hey, I don't like that, right? And I don't want to take away the dog's ability to communicate these types of things. If anything, I want to let them know, yes, you can do that. You just don't need to do it so intensely if it was really intense, right?
It'll be respected.
Exactly. Exactly.
I've heard from the training world.
Sure.
Some people don't like to correct dogs while they're socializing.
Sure.
What is
Yeah. So that's kind of the age-old, like, oh, well, like, let's say because these dogs all have e-collars on, obviously. Let's say I corrected that dog with an e-collar near her. A lot of people will say, oh, well, isn't she going to develop this association that the dog did that, right? That just comes down to how much groundwork are we putting in before we start the correction, right? When we give corrections with anything, we always attach them to ourselves first and foremost. We always attach corrections first and foremost to us, right? So anytime I deliver a consequence for a behavior, I'm always utilizing a marker with that, right? So you hear markers commonly used with positive, right? A clicker, a yes mark, something like that that attaches, hey, that thing you're doing is what this reward is for. They work equally with punishment, obviously, right? So if I'm gonna give a correction for something, I would identify that mistake with no. That would let the dog know, right? That thing you're doing right there is incorrect. Additionally, it lets them know this correction is about to come from me, right? So I don't run the risk of them having this superstitious association with the other dog because this correction came out of thin air, right? It didn't, right? I clearly identified the thing they were doing, and that wasn't just the dog, right? It was the behavior you were exhibiting when you were near the dog. And additionally, right, it preps them for something is about to happen now. Now, obviously, you know, you get into, is it still possible to develop like a temporary superstitious association? Like, yes, you know what I mean? Like, let's say, you know, obviously we're doing a condensed program with her, right? We're doing it over the course of a week as opposed to 10 weeks, right? So we're not gonna have as much time to be like, well, we're gonna spend an entire week conditioning our markers in and this and that, right? So, you know, there's gonna be a time, I'm sure at some point when I do need to give her a correction for something that no marker hasn't fully been conditioned in. And she may for a split second be like, wait a minute, I don't know where that came from, right? She may say, you know, I don't know where that came from, right? But through a handful of repetitions of that and through me not removing her from the situation and then her going near the dog and it not happening again and stuff like that, she'll quickly start to put it together. You know what I mean? I think sometimes we look at dogs like they're dumber than they are. You know what I mean? Like they can figure this stuff out way better than we think a lot. This is great though. Again, I'm seeing nothing concerning here. I haven't seen a single thing that I'm worried about. If anything, again, this is the kind of stuff that this dog really needs, right?
Yeah, and it's hard to find. Both, I think, they just weren't sure what would happen.
100%.
Right? So it's like,
and you don't want to be willy-nilly about it, obviously. We have to know and trust the dogs, at least initially, as we're gauging through this stuff. And again, I don't get crazy about the like, oh, she's doing the head over the back or anything like that. But you do want to monitor those things because it does put the dog in a vulnerable position sometimes. Let's say Yes, right? Because let's say he's laying down, right? She's got head over the shoulders, right? And she's really examining. She's not doing anything wrong necessarily, but then he gets up real quick. And because she's hyperactive, her instinct goes to grab, right? It could create a problem, right? So I'm not going to stop it necessarily, but I do want to monitor it closely, knowing it's a vulnerable spot. And then additionally, as he puts pressure on her like that, right, he gets a little bit more dominant and stuff with her, I want to watch how she responds to that. So those are all the things I look for when I'm doing an assessment like this.
And if it's too much, or she responds, are you like, it's not a good fit in terms of a playmate?
Not necessarily, right? I would look at what is the problem, right? Let's say he started getting really, really pushy with her again, and she got off put by that and let out a little snap or something like she did before, right? That's not a bad thing. Then I would look at how does he respond to that, right? Does he respect that cue, right? If he doesn't, depending on, how intense of a response it was, I may let it slide a little more. If it persists and he keeps pushing and amping himself up every time she does that, I would then step in and I would correct him for that. I would let him know, hey, you got to back off when she starts giving you those signs. For the most part, I want to let the dogs figure a lot of this stuff out on their own, and I want to be there to help mitigate problems if I notice they continue to escalate. So we just have to identify which dog is being the problem in that moment and how do I need to resolve that situation. On the contrary, there's some dogs that are like fearful dogs, right? That they'll go park themselves in a corner over there, right? And they won't do anything. And other dogs will walk near them or go up to them, like let out a little grumble or growl or something like that. And even though that dog is saying they're uncomfortable in that moment, I need to allow the dogs to push on that a little bit to help get them out of their shell sometimes.
Yeah. Do you ever run into an issue where, because I know some people I know have like their anchor dog.
Sure.
Yeah. Tried to get all the dogs who are either dog aggressive or under socialized or whatever out of their shell. Is there any consequence to exposing that dog to so many?
Good question. Yeah. I think you have to be mindful of the situations you're putting them in, right? So like if let's say he was my demo dog, right? He's the one I pull out every time I want to test another dog. And every single time that happens, that other dog goes after him, right? If he's really stable, he'll be fine. But if it continues to happen every single time, he's going to start getting a little apprehensive about coming into those socials. So you just have to balance it out a little bit, which is why, we have access to so many dogs. I don't have to put my one dog in that position every single time, right? Because I also think equally, right, we had somebody comment on a post about him, right? The dog I was referring to in from Colorado, day one, didn't go after him, but like kind of snapped in his face a little bit. And he got a little wigged out from it and stuff. And they were like, oh my God, you're putting him in this vulnerable position, stuff like that. We also don't want to hold our dogs back from the realities of what happens in the world, right? It's important for them to learn what to do when they're encountered with those situations, right? Fight or flight, right? We need them to understand, safety and danger, like all of those types of things. And that's all important things for them to be exposed to. We just have to moderate how much it's happening. It's the same deal with like stress, right? A lot of people try to avoid stress at all costs in training, right? Stress is not this bad thing, right? Like when I learn new things, I get a little stressed out from it, and moderate stress is good for a dog, right? It's good for them to learn through. Now, this is exactly what I was talking about, right? Kind of vulnerable position. She was over top of him. He's kind of kicking at her and stuff. So I need to see how she responds to those things. And again, she's doing very well with it, right? But yeah, stress, moderately is good, but we have to make sure everything isn't super stressful all the time, because we don't want our dogs to exist forever in this state of stress, If anything, if stress is happening, we need to hit a point where they've overcome that hurdle and that stress, they be successful with it, and then, Theo, cut it out. And then become confident through that before we encounter the next stressor then at that point.
Yeah, I had my most recent foster who got adopted, he had fear aggression.
Sure.
And had just a really low threshold, so
yeah.
The stress thing was basically, we just
sure.
worked out his stress levels.
That's just it, right? Like a lot of those dogs, when we get these like massively fearful dogs in, some of the best things we can do is just incrementally put them in situations that they're scared of and teach them, okay, nothing bad happened. Now we move on to the next one. Nothing bad happened, This is great. Give her a couple more minutes here. We're starting off strong. So like if I get a new client in or something that has like a really reactive dog or dog aggressive dog or anything like that, sometimes by starting with the social and showing them, hey, this is who your dog is, right? It could at least temper it, like these owners, right? Like, it's not like you're gonna go home and she's just gonna be perfect for them, right? Like, they're not even here to learn half of the stuff, right?
Go watch all the videos.
Yes, but them being able to see, just first and foremost, like, oh my God, like, she can play, right? Like, she's clearly not an aggressive dog. That could just, for an owner, be such a relief, where if they don't get past anything else, but they know their dog can socialize with other dogs, it's like, all right, well, that's a huge hurdle. So I try to go for those like little wins for people and just like stack those up a little bit at a time, you know?
Yeah, like barking.
What's that?
Are they usually, if that burst of energy triggers another dog, what does that look like to the other dog? Is it usually like...
Yeah, so it could be a couple things. It could be running over barking, right? It could be, that could trigger dogs to go and like bite. Yeah. It just depends, so. But that's an example of a dog coming in hot, right? And it's not a problem, right? If you have balanced dogs, they're gonna receive that energy pretty well, so.
If you have a dog that barks and plays police, do you correct them?
It depends, right? Again, you know, so for example, the dog in from Colorado, that's kind of what he did, right? So he would run over and like kind of snap bark, right? He would like snap, right? That obviously would be an inappropriate behavior, right? That's a really controlling behavior. Some dogs just want to be a part of it and just run over and start barking like, hey, I'm here, right? Again, that I don't necessarily have as much of a problem with. So it's very, all these things are very dog dependent. And as you work with more dogs, right, and you socialize more dogs, you'll start to notice patterns in their behavior, right? Like, so her, for example, we've seen so many, like as soon as you brought her out of the car, right? I've seen so many dogs with that same energy at this point that I kind of know how they're going to respond when we put them into this, you know? All right, so here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna stand in the middle of the room here. I'm gonna have Bridget just kind of walk around me here, and all I care about is that she's not making forward movement towards the dog. That's it, right? No. No.
So she can look?
She can look. I have no problem with looking. The attention will naturally come as she starts to understand what she can't do, right? Good. Then obviously if we can get her taking rewards, when she starts checking in, that's where we would begin giving the reward, right? Want that? No? No. And then each time we're able to decrease this level a little bit. There we go.
Is that usually standard? You go higher to lower?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the dog starts off more amped up, right? The more amped up they are, the higher the level you need to bring that down. And then as they settle down, they're more responsive to a lower level. The less distracted they are, right? Now again, keep in mind, right, we're expediting a lot of this process. You know, in a lot of cases, we wouldn't start session one doing all of this. We would focus on teaching things and stuff like that, but I'm trying to make sure we get as much out of this as possible, you know? So we're kind of just getting past these hurdles now, right? And additionally, right, we already let her socialize for an hour before this, so I'm not running as much of the risk of, again, the superstitious association, right? Is it the dog that bit me? Because she just had an hour of playing, right? So we're separating here, right? When you're off leash, go for it. You know what I mean? Let it rip, right? When you're on leash, you've got to focus in.
Yeah. Are you looking for basically like she's successful 80% of the time?
Yeah, I mean, so right now she's been successful for the last handful of minutes here, obviously. We haven't needed to give any corrections. And she's doing well, but you can tell she's still kind of figuring it out. You know what I mean? She's working through it. She's doing it well, but she's not 100% confident in what she's doing. So right now, especially if we're needing to use any sort of higher corrections for things, once they figure it out, I want to make sure that we give them enough time to be confident in the decision of doing it correct, right? Sometimes it's like as soon as we get success, it's like we move on to the next thing, as opposed to like let them exist in that success for a little bit, you know? So that's what I'm looking to see here. So like when we're working with reactivity, there's some trainers out there that focus on like, they'll call it like loading, right? So like basically what they mean by that is that sequence where you'll see them like notice the dog, start perking up, then growling, then lunging, right? I do not get crazy with that stuff, right? I focus on a clear expectation that we're gonna give them and I hold them to that expectation. The way I've always looked at reactivity and like that, like a lot of people like, they correct for looking, they correct for loading, they're like correcting for all sorts of stuff like that, is dogs are novel, right? If anything, maybe she's a little unsure about dogs, right? And if she's nervous and unsure about this thing, right, it's so unrealistic for me to say, don't look at it, right? Also, looking is a great way for the dog to observe and start to get used to being around the dog in the first place, right? So I don't want to take away that ability, right? But I want them to keep their impulses under control around the dog, right? And what happens is we saw the progression here just with Charlie, right? Charlie came in, hyper fixated on Charlie, right? Not controlling the impulse. We corrected for that. She controlled the impulse, but was still hyper fixating. Then it went from she controlled the impulse and was fixating some of the time. Then it went from she was still interested in Charlie, but, wait, I'm losing my train of thought here. She was interested in Charlie, but she wasn't fixating anymore. Then it went to, she just ignored Charlie completely, right? And we got to the same place without needing to correct for that because we were able to see her start to get comfortable with being around the dog, right? And as she got comfortable with being around the dog, she didn't feel the need to hyperfixate anymore, right? So sometimes we want to see it be this like off switch where it's like it just goes from like she's aroused and reacting to she's just not doing anything, right? And we forget about that like middle ground that they have to go through. Pretty good. Again, you know, Triple confirming like we're rushing through things for sure. You know what I mean?
Yes.
But like I said, I want to make sure we get the most out of this for her. So, and these are all techniques that we're like using her to demonstrate them. But these are all things you could begin to kind of implement a little bit here, a little bit there, stuff like that. So, you're doing very well, and you're going to be very tired every single day. You're going to go back to the hotel and just sleep. So. All right, let's go ahead and take her outside. Come on.
And so the non-rush version is basically you ideally teach everything.
Step by step. Well, you know, some of it would be, you know, obviously using positive reinforcement first if we had a very food motivated dog. If the dog was just moderately food motivated, like I know you said she's pretty food motivated. Sometimes we'll get dogs that are motivated, but around distractions and stuff, they're not super motivated, you know?
That is true. Like
if that's the case.
Saw red, which is red, there's no food thing.
Yes. You know, like we'll see, we'll get plenty of dogs that come in that have like a little bit of food drive, but like not enough to really like lean into it that heavily. And we wind up just teaching everything with the Ecollar still, but not rushing through it would be just piecing it together more slowly, right? So like we wouldn't go from introducing Ecollar with the walking to then bringing a huge distraction in with that same thing and socializing all of that within one session, right? We would start by, all right, well, let's start again, leash and prong, let's shape the behavior first, right? Then we'll layer in Ecollar around minimal distractions. Then we'll increase some distractions a little bit with that. Then we'll go back to leash with a bed command. Then we'll intro Ecollar with it, et cetera, et cetera.
And is the logic of not rushing through to give the dog more reps,
more time to be successful.
Yeah, okay,
yes.
Okay, I got you.
Right, you know, if we spent a week working that healing first, maybe we would have needed to correct her 3 times around the dog instead of 10 times. You know what I mean?
Okay.
So you get into like, you know, we want to try to make it as fair as possible for the dog, but with certain things, you know, if we get a dog that's coming in that's having human aggression issues or serious dog aggression issues or something like that, it's like fair kind of gets on the back burner a little bit until we start to get that under control. Yep. You know what I mean? So again, it all comes back to the dog we're working with, you know, like Theo in there, that golden retriever, he's a pretty happy-go-lucky dog. He's here for a board and train right now. We're kind of taking our time with things. There's not any big issues that we have to like get past right away, right? Okay, that looks pretty good. It's a little better than last time. Hey, how are you?
Come on.
It's pretty good. Yeah, right? So I don't know about that. That was pretty good. You definitely see her controlling that one. That dog was kind of getting a little amped up towards her. It was all good.
So basically, is this where most mistakes are made? That really she's progressed so much better, obviously, than
Yep.
when she started, and then they let that
Yep.
little 10%
100%.
slide.
And that's that slippery slope back, you know? Where again, like we become okay with better without understanding that completely dilutes the criteria of what we're trying to get the dog to do, you know?
And how long usually does that slippery slope end up?
Well, I mean, forever, realistically, right? Like, if any of these dogs, let's say we had a month where she's good, right? And then for whatever reason, little by little, she started getting a little aroused again, right? And we started letting it slide, letting it slide, letting it slide. It would slowly taper back to being really bad again. Like, if I were to just give you one of my dogs with no understanding of how to use their training, and you just, like, let them do whatever, within a couple months, like, they'd be terrible, you know? Dogs are opportunists. Like, training isn't this thing that you, like, put on a dog and then they're trained, right? It's a communication system, right? And if that communication system is not there and they don't understand how to communicate with you and you don't understand how to communicate with them, everything is going to be a mess. It's literally the equivalent of like if somebody just dropped you off in a foreign land and you didn't know the language and nobody else knew the language, right? Like your life would just fall apart immediately, right? There'd be no rules, there'd be no boundaries, you know?
Yeah.
Be no understanding of anything.
And how, because I assume, like you pushing for that last 10 probably so hard.
Yep.
So how do you communicate that well to clients?
Yeah.
I assume that's probably really difficult.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
You just say it a lot. I mean, as far as like getting them to understand it. I mean, there's some people that just, some people can't get out of their own way, you know? Like you have these pictures in your head of like what things should or shouldn't be. And sometimes it's so hard to accept any other truth, right? Like the thing I just described of like the training isn't this thing you put on a dog and they're trained. Like that's one that we tell people so much, but still we'll run into situations every now and then where like a dog will do a board and train and they'll go home and the trainer or the owner doesn't do anything for the first week. And they come back for the follow-up and they're like, you didn't train my dog. And it's like, well, we did, right? Like, that's not how it works. So, you know, you just get them to understand it over time, you know, and teach them, you know, the biggest thing is highlighting the things that they're doing incorrect, but not in like a judgmental way, just in like a, hey, like if you want this to be better, right? This is what I'm doing that's making this like good, right? And this is what you're doing that's confusing the dog, right? Yeah, it's funny, you look at reactivity sometimes, and everybody always says, like, how do I stop reactivity? Or you'll hear trainers go, you know, teach a really good heel, teach a really good position, this, that, which we'll utilize those things, like, for leverage, for sure. But reactivity in itself is just a behavioral issue. It's no different than jumping, right? You could stop it without the dog knowing anything, right?
And do you change? I guess probably you don't. Like, it doesn't really matter where the reactivity is coming from. Like whether it's like fear or
sure.
you know, whatever.
Well, it matters, but it doesn't matter, right? So it doesn't matter from the standpoint of like, we're still going to work through it all the same. But I do think it's important to understand where it stems from to make sure we're not fighting an uphill battle, right? I want to make sure, no, come on.
What's an example of that?
Yeah, so I want to make sure that, let's say we have like frustration-based reactivity, which in a lot of cases, like a dog like her, I would likely consider probably a frustration-based reactivity, meaning she just wants to get to the other dog. Yep. You know what I mean? Like it's not coming from this place of I'm scared of other dogs, I want to attack other dogs, anything like that. She just wants to get to the other dog, and she's been held back forever from getting to that other dog, right? So in a case like that, we need to reduce the frustration, which is the source of that is the leash. It's her pulling into that leash towards the other dog constantly, right? So I talk about, you know, barriers. If you remove the need of the barriers, right, you get the dog to understand them better, right? If I remove the need of, like, if this leash wasn't on her right now, we probably could keep her in our space still, right? Then let's say fear-based reactivity. Let's say the dog is scared of other dogs, and where the reactivity came from is other dogs were constantly coming into her space, right? The owner was letting other dogs approach, and she started learning, I'm scared, I want these other dogs to go away, and if I throw this big stink, it's gonna make the other dog go away, right? So I need to reduce or eliminate the reason why that started, which is in addition to holding her to a higher standard and correcting for that reactivity, I have to make sure dogs aren't approaching her anymore, right? So she starts to see me as the one that's gonna handle that for her, right? You know, yeah, and with that, there's also other things we have to do as far as the solution, where if I have a dog that actually is aggressive and is reacting out of aggression, obviously we need to stop the source of the problem, which is the reactivity, but in addition, we need to work on the socialization issue, right? Why do you feel like you need to be aggressive towards other dogs? Do we need to work on improving your social skills? And if we could do that, that will help that you're not fighting an uphill battle of like teaching this dog to bottle it in even though they hate that other dog over there. It's like, how do I get you to not hate that dog over there? The process is the same, right? We just put in place more safety protocols, right? So let's say she was actually dog aggressive. That first time we put the muzzle on and put her in the group, she went after the other dogs, right? Obviously, we can't just let her go after other dogs, but we do need to socialize her still. So I would need to then look at, I need to create this prerequisite of having some communication established to be able to discipline for that choice. Right? So if we have enough training on the dog or a baseline of training on the dog, what we could do is when we put her in that situation and she goes to aggress, I can correct her for that, right? And then at least I can get you neutral where you're not outwardly going after these dogs, so I could begin that socialization process of getting you used to being around them. From there, it's just slower, right? A lot of dogs that are actually aggressive, you correct from initially and you teach them, don't fight, flight if anything, right? Give yourself space, go somewhere else, right? Then it just takes some time for them to get comfortable.
So basically, you would do the basic stuff that we did day one.
Yep.
You would do it in reverse.
Kind of.
Probably
yeah.
Not.
Yeah. I would create a little bit more, training and stuff like that first. I would make sure the dog understands the Ecollar enough where I can give a big correction in that situation if I need to.
Right. And then if it was human aggression.
Yeah, I mean, human aggression is, in most cases, like if the dog is acting aggressively towards me, right? And the dog is getting dropped off for a board and train or something like that, the dog just learning to work with me will eliminate that problem, right? So 9 out of 10 times, they're acting aggressively out of fear, right? And same deal, me just holding that leash, them being on a muzzle, and they maybe try to bite me 5 times, 10 times, something like that, and they just realize, like, it's not making me go away, right? The reinforcement behind the behavior, which is it makes me go away, isn't happening, right? And that usually works through the problem on its own. We rarely ever need to correct for aggression towards us. Rarely ever,
And would you in that case? Or would you? Or
no, I think
it's not necessary.
I think it's unnecessary because 9 out of 10 times them realizing we're not backing down in that situation is so powerful in itself that it resolves the issue.
And how do you what do you look for to transition off muzzle to transition where you're like, okay, cool, it's you can see the shift in their body language. It's hard to say, like you kind of just gotta like intuitively do it, right? And then, I try to prep them as much as possible before it, where I almost kind of push their buttons a little more than usual to see, like we did with the social, like I need to see who the dog is, right? So I'll take things like a nail trim, examining the dog, right? Tight spaces with the dog, things like that. And I want to see what they're going to do in any number of those scenarios so that when I go to actually interact with them when the muzzle is off, I can feel confident that they're either not going to bite or if they are, what the trigger is. The other thing too is like most of the time, the ones that you really think are going to be aggressive are not the ones you have to worry about. Like 9 out of 10 times when we get these dogs that come in that owners are like, he's so aggressive, whether it's towards dogs, whether it's towards people, whatever it is, most of those dogs are so freaking easy, it's ridiculous. And as long as you don't do something really stupid, like you're going to be fine. Most of those cases, all the bites that have happened have been people doing stupid things, right? Like dogs laying in the corner and then your drunk uncle goes and like bombards them, you know what I mean? Like something like that.
or the dog's like laying on the couch sleeping, and then your little cousin goes over and tries to like snuggle up with them or something. It's like the ones you got to be worried about are usually the more quiet ones. That like, you know, I don't believe that they're like unpredictable by any means. I think all these situations are typically very predictable, but their fuse is so short that they don't give you very many warning signs to get into it.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely for sure.
Yeah.
She was saying how, I was asking her, how do you tell the difference between a dominant dog?
Sure.
And one that's just scared.
Yeah.
And active. And she's like, imagine if you know the dog, if you would drop that dog in the middle of nowhere, what would it do?
Yep.
Would it basically look around and be like, interesting, like where am I, whatever, or would they start running around and try to hide and be nervous about it? That's a very good way to think about it.
Yeah.
Jimmy would 100% be the latter.
So to give you an example of exactly that and kind of what she's talking about, right? A truly confident dog doesn't feel like they need to put on this big show.
Right.
You know what I mean? Even with people, right? Like truly confident people carry themselves in a way where they don't need to be yelling and screaming all the time, right? They're not the guy at the bar that's picking fights with everybody and you know, shouting and yelling insults and stuff like that to make themselves feel better, right? There was this German Shepherd I worked with a long time ago. His name was Resner, and he was like a really, really good working line German Shepherd. He's from this phenomenal breeder in Kentucky, and he was a legit dog, man. I mean, he was like protection trained and like, he was a scary dog. He's a big dude, right? And he, I went to the house one time to go pick him up from the owners. He was boarding with us. And I remember walking to the house and I was like, man, I've never been to his house before. I'm like, I'm gonna knock on this door, and this dog's probably gonna go bananas and like this and that. I knocked on the door. This dog didn't even budge. I walked in the house. He like looked at me for half a second, then went back to sleeping and this and that. Like he was so confident with himself that he wasn't even concerned about what was going on in there, right? But this is the dog that also had like 5 bites on his record, you know what I mean? And it was all over situations of him. He just didn't want you to do something. There's one scenario, he bit one of my coworkers when I used to work somewhere. And it was simply because they popped a leash on him because they were going to go walk him back into his crate, and he knew that meant he was going back in his crate and he wanted nothing to do with it.
And that's probably like, they're what, 1% less than?
Yeah, I mean,
dogs like that?
I don't know. I mean, I think there's a decent amount of them. You know, and then also, right, like dominance doesn't always mean aggression, you know what I mean? You get into like true dangerous aggressive dogs, yeah, there's not as many as you think. Even most trainers you'll see out there, even there's so many like these like popular trainers out there that post all these videos every other day of a dog in a muzzle freaking out and going crazy, and they're like, look at this aggressive dog. Most of the time those dogs are not that aggressive. Just seeing if she does it, obviously. Now, if the dog already knows the command, in a lot of cases you could just jump right into correcting if they don't do it. So I'm gonna start at a nice low level here, and I'm just gonna start by trying to do that. Okay, and I'll just do this a bunch of times. Sit. Now, a couple things. So one, the way that I teach a stationary position, I don't care if they lay down, right? We just wanna keep them in one spot here. Now, to the thing you said about the weight, not that I care that anybody is saying wait or anything, but wait, stay, like any sort of command like that is very redundant in the context of this, because there's never a time you're gonna tell them sit, but get up whenever you want to, right? So we just wanna make sure we have a clear beginning and a clear end to our positions. So beginning is obviously the command itself. Okay, the release is the end.
And do you ever teach it with like, with negative reinforcement where you hold to release?
Good question. Sit. So the use of negative reinforcement, right, versus positive punishment, which is what a single tap correction would be, is does the dog know it or not already, right? If they know it already, I'm not really trying to reinforce or increase the likelihood of something. I'm trying to decrease the likelihood of her just not listening to it, right? Now, let's take something like a bed. We'll probably use continuous pressure to teach the bed, because that's usually one they don't have as much of an understanding of. Okay, sit. Depending on how the dog responds to the e-collar, Sometimes, even if we would, in a perfect world, use negative reinforcement to teach any of those types of things, sometimes it's not as easy to do so, because some dogs will go in and out of having like big responses to the e-collar. Like let's say at like a 5, because she was so sensitive, she's just like jumping all over the place and stuff like that, right? That's not gonna be as conducive to like holding and teaching her to escape that pressure, because she's already so frantic, right? So in a lot of those cases, just correcting for them not doing it, and then using your leash as the negative reinforcement can be a little bit easier. But again, it's all very dog dependent. Okay.
And how many reps do you do, or what is the interval before moving on to the next level?
Yeah.
With our duration, distraction,
Sure. So each time if I'm gonna move on to the next thing, I wanna see the dog proficient, obviously, with what it is that I'm asking them to do, but not just proficient in it. I wanna see them look relatively confident in their decision of what it is they're doing. That doesn't necessarily mean they're happy and like so excited and stuff like that, but do they seem pretty sure of themselves of what it is I'm asking them to do, you know? And you could see that shift sometimes where like initially when I was doing that duration, she was kind of like, am I supposed to stay, supposed to get up? To there, she started consistently getting into position and just like, all right, I'm supposed to stabilize, you know? Some people will just wait until the dog has done it, and sometimes they're doing it, but like they're like right on the fence of making a mistake still, you know? Okay.
I notice from your handling that it almost feels like you're walking in half speed.
Yeah.
That is it?
You know, it's funny, like when you're working with dogs, especially some of the high energy dogs, the more you slow things down, the more it forces the dog to focus. I think sometimes, like some people are just fast walkers and just kind of like go, go, go all the time. And they're working at that speed all the time and the dog just can't keep up. Or you're working so fast that you can't see the little mistakes that the dog is making.
Yeah, and I think it's just when you physically have to slow down, you are forced to communicate less information.
100%.
Because there's less going on. That is it?
Yeah, that's something I'm consistently telling clients is when they come in, they're saying things so fast sometimes. It's like, sit, no sit, you know? And it's like they're just not giving them a chance to like process the piece of information that you've just thrown at them.
Yeah.
2 more.
So in that scenario, I've done it where if I have some distance and then they're stationary, I mark with okay when I'm away and then I go back to reward.
You mean mark with good?
Sorry, mark with good when I'm away and I go back to reward the stationary position.
Totally fine. Yeah, so good, right? All it does is mark a moment in time and tell them, I like what you're doing, continue doing it, and I'm gonna bring you a reward, right? So you could mark from anywhere with that, and that marker buys you the time to then go deliver the reward, right? And technically speaking, when you get into, you know, the good marker and the way we used to use it in like the competitive dog world, we wanna mark at the highest point of distance or distraction, right? Meaning, right, if I'm going 100 yards away from her, I'm gonna mark good at that 100 yards, signifying you're doing well at the most difficult part of this exercise. Or let's say that situation where that door slammed happened again and she held it. I'd mark with good immediately right there because that's the highest point of distraction, right? At the most difficult part of the exercise, we're letting you know you're doing it well. Now, getting into, again, since we're kind of going over technique and stuff here right now, what you just did right there, your mark was fine, right? But then you did this, right? So what's gonna happen, at some point she's gonna get up to try to meet you halfway with that, right? So I try to mark, get all the way back, then deliver it.
I see.
Let's see, is she gonna take it? Hey, there we go.
Okay.
Nope, didn't, spit it out.
She's like, I don't like that.
Unbelievable.
Try again. Oh,
These things these dogs freaking love usually. So that's where you get into reward placement, right? You want to reward in place of the position you're reinforcing, right? So if it's a down, I don't want to reward high up. I want to reward low to the ground to continue reinforcing that stability, right? if I'm rewarding a heel position, right, I wouldn't reward across the body for it because that would encourage the dog foraging and crossing in front of me, right? I would reward in place, et cetera, et cetera. And again, those are things that they don't really matter that much because we're not doing sport dog training, but they're good to know. You did good. So saw a handful of dogs in the park, did better, I would say. You know, not as explosive as she was last time. And socially, obviously fine. Picked up the sits and the bed's fine. She's moving along, you know, I mean, today was a little bit more boring as far as, you know, just getting some more groundwork in, but she did great. So tomorrow we'll test this stuff a little bit more. So we'll work the sits, well, one, we'll work the bed stays probably at the other facility while other dogs and stuff are around. We'll work the sit stays probably at the park. We'll go back to the park with her again, obviously. And we'll likely start the come command with her and start to get that established. And then the last one is gonna be just taking all that and just proofing it.